We are often taught that the Ottoman Empire was a beacon of civilization, a golden age of art and architectural wonder, but hidden behind the gilded gates of the Topkapi Palace lay a darkness so profound that it did not merely punish the body, but sought to dismantle the very soul of the condemned. This is the story of a justice system where mercy was a myth, and where the price of order was paid in blood. To understand why a society capable of such beauty could inflict such meticulously designed agony, we must discard our modern notions of fairness, for in the Sultan's shadow, punishment was not a correction, but a theatre of absolute power designed to silence dissent before it was even whispered. Before we descend into these archives of suffering, ensure you are subscribed. And tell me in the comments below, from which safe corner of the world are you watching this nightmare unfold? In the labyrinthine streets of 16th century Istanbul, a peculiar silence reigned. It was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating quiet of a storm held perpetually in check. Western visitors, accustomed to the chaotic squalor of Paris or London, were often struck by the terrifying discipline that permeated the Ottoman capital. Ogier, Ghiselin de Busbecq, the ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire, wrote in his letters home with a mixture of admiration and dread, noting that among thousands of janissaries, there was no idle chatter, no insolence, only a stillness that resembled that of statues. But what Busbecq sensed, and what the citizens knew all too well, was that this order was not born of natural obedience. It was a structure built upon a foundation of absolute, unwavering consequence. The Ottoman state viewed itself as a body, with the Sultan as the head and the subjects as the limbs. And in this ruthless anatomy, a limb that twitched out of turn had to be corrected with surgical precision. The justice system here was not designed merely to punish a crime after it had occurred, but to etch a permanent lesson into the collective memory of the populace. It was a psychological architecture where the fear of pain was far more potent than the pain itself, creating a society where men police their own thoughts before the state ever had to intervene. To understand the weight of this atmosphere, one must look not at the grand executions that happened in the public squares, but at the smaller, more intimate rituals of discipline that took place daily in schools, barracks, and marketplaces. This brings us to the Falaka, a punishment that sounds deceptively simple to the modern ear. Yet, in practice, it was a masterpiece of agonizing efficiency. It was the empire's primary method of correction, a tool that did not seek to end a life, but to make every step taken afterward a reminder of the state's authority. Imagine for a moment that you are a young merchant in the bustling Grand Bazaar, or perhaps a soldier who has failed to shine his equipment to the requisite brilliance. You are not dragged to a dungeon. Your trial is swift, often conducted right there in the open, amidst the scent of spices and the murmur of the crowd. The instrument itself was terrifying in its simplicity. The falaka was a wooden board with a loop of rope, designed to secure the feet in an upright position, exposing the vulnerable, tender souls to the air. As your ankles are locked into place and the pole is twisted to tighten the grip, you are rendered completely immobile, your connection to the earth severed. The sensory experience of what follows is something that victims carried with them to the grave. The human foot is a marvel of biological engineering, a dense network of nerve endings designed to feel the texture of the ground, the temperature of the stone, and the slightest shift in balance. To target this area is to bypass the body's natural defenses and send shockwaves of pure, unadulterated distress directly into the nervous system. The executioner, often a man chosen for his rhythmic precision rather than his brute strength, would begin the strokes with a flexible wooden rod or a thick whip of bull hide. The first blow does not merely sting. It burns with a heat that feels as though the skin has been touched by a branding iron. Because the feet are held high, the blood rushes away, leaving the nerves exposed and screaming with each subsequent impact. The sensation evolves from sharp agony to a dull, throbbing devastation that seems to pulse in time with your own heartbeat. There is no gore, no theatrical spray of crimson to shock the onlookers, only the rhythmic thud of wood against flesh and the stifled gasps of the condemned. It was a punishment of sound and sensation, not of spectacle. Primary accounts from the era describe the aftermath as a nightmarish ordeal that extended far beyond the beating itself. When the Falaka was released, the victim's feet would be swollen, shapeless, and bruised to a deep, angry purple. The cruelest part of the sentence was often the requirement that the punished individual return to their duties immediately. To walk on feet that have been pulped internally is to experience a new kind of torture, where the simple act of standing becomes a heroic feat of endurance. For days, perhaps weeks, the victim would hobble through the city, their broken gait serving as a living, moving billboard for Ottoman justice. Every wince, every slow step was a signal to the community that the law was watching. It was this visibility that made the Falaka so effective. It did not remove the worker from the economy or the soldier from the regiment. It simply transformed them into walking monuments of obedience. However, the Falaka was merely the threshold of the Ottoman House of Pain. It was the punishment for those who could still be saved, for those whose transgressions were seen as correctable flaws in the social fabric, but for those who dared to strike at the pillars of the state itself, for those whose crimes were deemed a cancer rather than a mere ailment. The empire had methods that transcended physical pain and ventured into the realm of existential horror. As we move from the bruised soles of the feet to the cold steel of the executioner's sword, we leave behind the hope of rehabilitation and enter a darkness from which there is no return. The transition from discipline to destruction was often separated by a single word from a judge, a single nod from a vizier, shifting the fate of a man from a painful lesson to a final, silent verdict. While the Falaka broke the spirit through the soles of the feet, the sword was reserved for those who threatened the very head of the empire. In the Ottoman worldview, execution was not merely the cessation of biological function. It was a grand, terrifying piece of state theatre designed to demonstrate the Sultan's godlike power over mortality itself. Beheading, or the removal of the burden of the head, as it was euphemistically termed in court chronicles, was the most universal solution to the problem of treason. Yet, to dismiss it as simple butchery would be to misunderstand the intricate psychology of the era. These were not the frenzied, chaotic mob killings seen in other parts of medieval Europe. They were conducted with a chilling, bureaucratic efficiency that frightened foreign observers far more than the violence itself. Consider the haunting case of Sheikh Bedreddin in 1420, a narrative that encapsulates the tragic collision between intellect and authority. Bedreddin was not a common bandit or a bloodthirsty warlord. He was a mystic, a respected judge, and a scholar whose theological brilliance had garnered him a following that stretched across the empire's social divide. But in the eyes of the state, his call for communal property and social equality was not philosophy, it was poison. When his rebellion was finally crushed, Bedreddin was brought to the town of Serres in modern-day Greece, not as a warrior, but as a prisoner of his own ideas. Imagine standing in the marketplace of Serres on that grey, windswept morning, The air would have been thick with the murmur of a crowd that was equal parts curious and terrified, gathered to witness the extinguishing of a mind that had dared to imagine a different world. The executioner, a figure draped in anonymity, did not act with malice, but with the dispassionate resolve of a civil servant. There were no lengthy speeches, no opportunities for the condemned to incite the crowd one last time. The sources tell us that the strike was swift, a single flash of steel that severed the scholar's connection to the mortal coil. His body was displayed not to mock him, but to serve as a grim physical proof that no amount of wisdom, sanctity, or public adoration could protect a man who had crossed the line of imperial tolerance. The silence that followed the thud of the blade was the true punishment, a heavy, oppressive message to every onlooker that the Sultan's justice was as inevitable as the setting sun. But if death was a finality, there were fates within the Ottoman penal code that were designed to linger, to turn the victim into a living ghost haunting the fringes of society. This brings us to a punishment that strikes a primal chord of fear in every human being: the extinguishing of sight. Eye gouging was a penalty specifically curated for those of high status, often rival princes or failed usurpers, for whom execution might have created a martyr, but for whom freedom was impossible. The logic was ruthlessly pragmatic. A blind man could not lead an army. A blind man could not read a map. And most importantly, a blind man could not look his subjects in the eye. The procedure itself was the stuff of nightmares, often carried out in the shadowed recesses of the Seven Towers fortress, rather than the open square. It was a punishment of intimacy, requiring the executioner to be terrifyingly close to the victim. We must rely on the whispers of history to reconstruct the scene, for few who endured it wrote of the experience. The victim would be restrained, the smell of iron and sweat filling their nostrils, as the world they knew, the faces of their children, the glory of the sunrise, the intricate patterns of the palace tiles, prepared to vanish forever. The instrument used was often a red-hot metal rod, chosen not for cruelty alone, but for its cauterizing effect, ensuring the victim survived the trauma to serve their sentence of darkness. The horror here lies not in the gore, but in the sudden, irreversible transition. One moment, there is light and color. The next, there is only a scorching pain, and then an eternal, suffocating obsidian void. This was known as the stolen horizon. The condemned were not killed. They were simply erased from the visual world. They remained alive, eating, breathing, and hearing the bustle of the empire moving on without them. But they were trapped in a solitary confinement that they carried with them wherever they went. For the Ottoman state, a blinded rival was a far more potent symbol than a dead one. A corpse is buried and forgotten, or worse, venerated. But a blinded prince, stumbling through the corridors of a palace he could no longer see, dependent on servants for his every need, was a pathetic, breathing reminder of the folly of ambition. It was a way of saying, "You may keep your life, but we have taken your world." This psychological dismantling was a core tenet of Ottoman justice, the understanding that the most effective prison is not made of stone walls, but of the limitations inflicted upon the human body itself. This philosophy of living erasure extended to the punishment of amputation, a penalty that marked the criminal class just as blinding marked the political elite. While the thief losing a hand is a trope often repeated in history books, the reality of it in the 16th century was a sentence to slow, grinding poverty in a society where manual labor was the primary means of survival. The loss of a hand was effectively an economic death sentence. The stump was not hidden. It was a brand, a scarlet letter carved in flesh that told every potential employer, every neighbor, and every stranger on the street exactly what this person was. The state did not need to build a dossier on the criminal. The criminal carried their record on their own body, visible to all, creating a class of outcasts who served as wandering scarecrows, warning the flock of the consequences of greed. Yet, as horrifying as these mutilations were, they were still inflicted upon the individual. The victims suffered, but their lineage, their name, and their legacy could theoretically survive. But there was another level of punishment, one so absolute that it sought to reach forward into time and snip the threads of the future. It was a punishment that targeted the very essence of identity and biological legacy, a horror that we must approach with a sober understanding of what it meant to be a man in a patriarchal empire. If the loss of a hand was a tragedy for the individual, the punishment known as emasculation was a catastrophe for the bloodline. In the modern world, we might view this act through the lens of physical violation, but to truly grasp its horror in the context of the Ottoman Empire, one must understand the currency of the time. In a dynastic society, a man's worth was measured not just by his deeds, but by his ability to project his name into the future. Children were the only true immortality available to mortal men, the vessels that carried memory, status, and inheritance forward. Therefore, to remove a man's capacity to father children was not merely a surgical procedure. It was an act of metaphysical annihilation. It was the state deciding that your story ends with you. This punishment was often reserved for specific contexts, sometimes political vengeance, sometimes for crimes of a sexual nature, and famously, for the creation of eunuchs who would serve in the most sensitive inner sanctums of the palace. The procedure, often carried out without the mercy of anesthesia, was a trauma so severe that survival was never guaranteed. Primary sources from the era, written in hushed tones, describe the silence of the nurseries that haunted these men for the rest of their lives. Imagine the psychological weight of knowing that you are the last of your name, that centuries of ancestors who fought and survived to bring you into existence have effectively hit a dead end. The victim of this punishment was left in a liminal space, existing between genders in a rigidly gendered world. They were stripped of the social armor of masculinity, often looked upon with a mixture of reverence and revulsion. In the high-stakes game of Ottoman court politics, this was the ultimate neutralization. A rival who could not sire an heir was no longer a threat to the throne. He was a political dead end, a fire that had been doused before it could spread. The brutality here lay in its cold calculation. The empire did not need to kill the man to kill his ambition. It simply took away his future, leaving him to age and wither like a tree that can bear no fruit. A living testament to the Sultan's power to control not just life and death, but the flow of generations itself. But even this, as spiritually devastating as it was, paled in comparison to the punishment that stands as the grim zenith of Ottoman terror tactics. It is a method that has etched itself into the nightmares of history, a word that even today causes an involuntary shudder: impalement. If other punishments were theatre, impalement was a symphony of agony conducted over days. It was reserved for the most heinous of crimes, high treason against the state, or for bandits who had terrorized the countryside to such an extent that the authorities felt a need to respond with monstrous force. The mechanics of impalement were designed with a singular, diabolical purpose: to prolong death for as long as humanly possible. The executioners who performed this were not mere butchers. They were experts in human anatomy, possessing a dark knowledge of how to navigate the body's internal geography without severing a vital organ. The victim was not tied to a post and shot. They were mounted upon a greased, sharpened stake, often rounded at the tip to prevent immediate puncture of the heart or lungs. Gravity, the most relentless force of nature, was then enlisted as the torturer as the victim was raised upright, planted into the ground like a grotesque sapling. Their own body weight would slowly drag them down. It was a death of millimeters. Historical accounts describe victims surviving in this state for hours, sometimes even days, lucid and screaming, as the stake worked its way through them. The psychological impact on the witnesses cannot be overstated. Imagine walking along a major trade route or approaching the gates of a rebellious city and seeing not one, but a forest of these stakes against the twilight sky, the silhouettes of writhing bodies, the sounds of low moans carried on the wind, and the smell of corruption would assault the senses long before you saw the faces of the condemned. This was the tactic famously adopted by Vlad III of Wallachia, known as the Impaler. It is a cruel irony of history that Vlad learned this method of psychological warfare during his time as a hostage in the Ottoman court. He took the empire's ultimate tool of terror and turned it back against them, creating forests of the dead that reportedly caused even the hardened Sultan Mehmed II to recoil in horror and turn his army back. But the Ottomans used it first, and they used it as a tool of total domination. The message of the stake was clear. You are not just a criminal, you are meat. It dehumanized the victim in the most absolute way possible, reducing a thinking, feeling human being to a mere object of display. It was the ultimate assertion of the state's power to transgress the sanctity of the human form. Unlike beheading, which was swift, or hanging, which was relatively clean, impalement turned the act of dying into a public spectacle of humiliation and helplessness. It forced the community to watch the slow, agonizing erosion of life, ensuring that the memory of the punishment would outlive the memory of the crime. In the remote provinces of the empire, where the Sultan's armies could not always be present, the threat of the stake served as a silent sentry. A single rumors of an impalement could pacify a region more effectively than 1,000 soldiers. It played upon the primal fear of a bad death, a death without dignity, without peace, and without end. This was the dark heart of the Ottoman justice system, the understanding that to rule over millions of diverse, potentially rebellious subjects, the state had to possess the capacity for a violence so extreme that it defied the imagination. It was a governance of nightmares, where the peace of the realm was purchased with the absolute, screaming agony of the few. To fully comprehend the machinery of Ottoman justice, we must look beyond the moment of execution and step into the purgatory that preceded it. The terror of the empire was not just in the sharpness of the blade, but in the agonizing, indefinite wait in the dark. This brings us to the Yedikule fortress, or the Fortress of the Seven Towers, a structure that looms in the history of Istanbul like a black scar. While the Topkapi Palace was the heart of the empire's splendor, Yedikule was its dungeon of despair, a place where foreign ambassadors, fallen sultans, and disgraced viziers were swallowed whole by the stone. Primary sources, including the letters of imprisoned European diplomats, describe Yedikule not as a place of frantic torture, but of a soul-crushing dampness and silence. The walls of these cells became a canvas of sorrow. If you were to walk into the Tower of Inscriptions today, you can still see the carvings left by prisoners centuries ago. Names, dates, prayers, and curses scratched into the rock with rusty nails or shards of bone. The days are long, but the night is eternal. One inscription reads, "A haunting whisper from a man whose identity has long since turned to dust." The psychological torture here was exquisite. The prisoner never knew when the door would open. Every creak of a hinge, every footstep in the corridor could be the bringer of food or the bringer of the silk cord. It is here, in the shadow of the executioner, that we encounter one of the most bizarre and chilling customs in human history. The race of death for high-ranking officials, particularly grand viziers who had fallen out of favour. The Ottomans offered a strange, almost ritualistic chance for survival. It was a custom that turned justice into a sport. When the death sentence was issued, the condemned man would be offered a cup of promised sherbet. If the sherbet was white, he was safe, merely exiled. But if the sherbet was red, it was the signal of doom. However, for a brief period in the empire's history, the condemned had one final option. He could run. The race would take place through the palace gardens. A sprint of roughly 300 meters from the palace kiosk to the fish market gate. The opponent was the head gardener, the bostancıbaşı. If the vizier reached the gate first, his sentence was commuted to exile. If the gardener caught him, the execution happened right there, amidst the scent of blooming tulips and cypress trees. It sounds like fiction, a macabre game played by bored monarchs. But it was a reality that underscored the Ottoman belief in fate. If a man could outrun death, perhaps Allah intended for him to live. But few ever won this race. The gardeners were young, fit, and trained for the chase. The viziers were often old, overweight, and paralyzed by fear. One can only imagine the desperate, heaving breath of a once powerful man, stumbling through the manicured lawns, hearing the heavy footsteps of his executioner closing in behind him. This brings us to the executioners themselves, a group of men who were perhaps the most unsettling figures in the entire Ottoman narrative. In the Western world, executioners were often public pariahs, hooded figures who lived on the edge of town. In the Ottoman palace, they were hiding in plain sight. They were the bostancı, the imperial gardeners. These men, thousands strong, were responsible for the exquisite beauty of the Sultan's grounds. They pruned the roses, they planted the hyacinths, and they rode the royal cakes on the Bosphorus. But they also served as the Sultan's bodyguards and his executioners. There is a terrifying poetic duality here. The same hands that tenderly nurtured the delicate petals of a flower in the morning were used to snap the neck of a traitor in the afternoon. But within the palace walls, there was an even more exclusive, more terrifying group, the mutes, or dilsiz, the sultans, obsessed with secrecy and silence, employed a corps of servants who were deaf and mute, or who had their tongues removed to ensure absolute discretion. These men were the ultimate confidants, present at the most secret meetings, hearing nothing, or at least telling nothing, and acting as the silent shadows of the throne, because they could not speak, they could not be bribed, they could not plead, and they could not be reasoned with. For the execution of royalty, princes, brothers of the Sultan, or high officials, it was forbidden to spill royal blood. The sword and the axe were considered too messy, too disrespectful for the holy lineage of the House of Osman. Instead, the method of choice was strangulation by a silk bowstring. The mutes were the masters of this silent art. Imagine the scene. A prince is summoned to a private chamber. The room is quiet. There are no guards in armor, only 3 or 4 men standing in the shadows, their faces blank, their eyes communicating in a sign language known only to the palace. There is no shouting, no reading of a verdict. The prince knows why he is there. The mutes move in perfect coordination. The struggle is brief, intense, and utterly silent. There is no clang of steel, no gunshot. Only the soft rustle of silk and the frantic scuffling of boots on the marble floor. This silence was the hallmark of Ottoman power. In the West, power was loud. Cannons, trumpets, shouting crowds. In the Topkapi Palace, power was a whisper. The Sultan often communicated with his mutes through a complex system of hand signals, creating a court of silence where a flick of the finger could end a life. This atmosphere created a paranoia that was thicker than the stone walls. No one was safe. A vizier could be dining with the Sultan one evening, enjoying the finest delicacies, and be strangled by the very servant who poured his wine the next morning. The existence of the mutes and the gardeners transforms the Ottoman palace from a mere administrative centre into a place of Gothic horror. It suggests that beauty and death were not opposites, but twins. The lush gardens were fertilised with the fear of those who walked them. The silence of the corridors was not peaceful, it was predatory. This was a system that had perfected the art of clean violence. It didn't need the messy public spectacles of the guillotine. It simply needed a strong cord and a pair of hands that would never tell the tale. As we visualize these silent killers, we must also remember the victims who vanished into this void. There were no public records of these private executions, no graves marked with the cause of death. A body would simply be slipped out of a side gate under the cover of darkness and cast into the Bosphorus, the strong currents carrying the evidence away toward the sea. The next day, the sun would rise, the gardeners would tend to their tulips, and the empire would continue to turn, fueled by the invisible oil of terror. It is this bureaucratic erasure, this seamless integration of murder into the daily routine of palace life, that makes the Ottoman method so uniquely disturbing. It wasn't an interruption of order, it was the order. As the sun sets over the Golden Horn today, casting long, jagged shadows across the ancient walls of the Topkapi Palace, the screams of the past have long since faded into the wind. The janissaries are gone, the executioners have laid down their cords, and the stakes have rotted into the earth. Tourists now walk through the very courtyards where viziers once raced for their lives, snapping photographs of the tiled walls that once muffled the sounds of strangulation. The empire has crumbled, leaving behind only the silent grandeur of its architecture. But as we walk away from this history, we are left with a discomfort that is hard to shake. It is easy to look back at the Ottomans and label them as monsters, to dismiss their justice as the cruelty of a bygone age. Yet, if we look closely into the dark mirror of their methods, we see a reflection that is terrifyingly familiar. They did not torture for pleasure, they tortured for order. They did not kill for sport, they killed for stability. They understood a truth that we often try to ignore, that civilization is a fragile thing, often held together not by the goodwill of men, but by the fear of consequence. The methods have changed, certainly. We no longer display heads on spikes or break feet with wooden rods, but the core dynamic remains. Power still demands obedience, and the state still holds the monopoly on violence. The Ottomans were simply honest enough to perform their justice in the sunlight, while we have learned to hide ours behind concrete walls and redacted documents. So, as you lay your head down tonight in the safety of your modern world, ask yourself this: is the silence outside your window truly the sound of peace? Or is it simply the sound of a different kind of fear, holding its breath, waiting for the order to be given? The empire is dead, but the shadow it cast, that never truly goes away,